Bluffing in poker is one thing, and can you bluff too much? When sitting at the nuclear poker table, does this principle still apply? Are today's nuclear leaders good poker players or amateurs? We'll never know until the bluff is called. So, how do Biden and Putin rate as diplomatic poker players? Join me, Jan Darasz, for How We Got Here.
The landscape of global geopolitics is undergoing a profound transformation, marked by the wanting influence of traditional concepts such as peaceful coexistence. In their place, a paradigm shift towards the anticipation of major power confrontation has taken roots. Nowhere is this shift more consequential than in the realm of nuclear security, where the stakes are nothing short of existential. In the newest chapter of this escalation, Russia has said it will conduct military drills that will involve the practice of utilizing tactical nuclear weapons. The Russian Ministry of Defense stated that these drills are aimed at enhancing readiness to carry out combat tasks, following what they perceive as provocative statements and threats from certain Western officials. Notably, the remarks by French President Emmanuel Macron and UK Foreign Secretary David Cameron, who respectively indicated readiness to provide ground troops and weapons support to Ukraine. Moscow has long warned of the inevitability of conflict with NATO should European members of the alliance intervene militarily in Ukraine. Nuclear weapons pose an enormous threat to humanity. Since their first use, different leaders and organizations have been trying to prevent proliferation to additional countries. Despite their efforts, more states than ever before have obtained nuclear weapons. The closest the world has ever come to a nuclear war was the Cuban crisis in 1962. After discovering Russian nuclear silos under construction on the island located just 160 kilometers from its shores, United States demanded the removal of the missiles. After a few tense days, an agreement was finally reached. During the Cold War, a period defined by tensions between the United States and Soviet Union, the threat of nuclear war was always present. But after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 and the Cold War ended, real progress was made to strengthen the Non-Proliferation Treaty. This process included encouraging former Soviet countries to adopt the treaty and stop the further use of nuclear weapons. Though many countries have worked to limit or eliminate nuclear weapons, threats still remain, and with the latest escalations it only grows. Containing nuclear weapons and preventing nuclear war remains one of the single greatest challenges facing world leaders today.
I'm delighted to welcome our guest today, Bartłomiej Kot, Resident Fellow at the Pulaski Foundation. So, welcome to the programme. Great to have you.
Great to be here.
We'll start off with the the latest nuclear threat to deploy weapons just for a training purpose in Belarusian territory. What do you make of that? Is that the latest Russian ploy to scare us or to get some leverage? What's the thinking, do you think, behind that?
Well, deterrence is always in the mind of the adversary. Recently, also on the NATO side, President Macron has stated that there might be plans from the NATO countries to deploy its own troops, the alliance own troops on Ukraine territory, in order to actually to restore the strategic ambiguity on the NATO side. But what is actually Russian president doing right now? It is pretty much sending a similar retaliatory message to NATO alliance that he is capable of escalating. He's capable of bringing the communication between NATO and Russian Federation to the extent that we should feel threatened, because he is ambiguous in what his next steps will be. So this is actually a message that is sent maybe not only to NATO alliance, not only to our leaders, but also to our own societies, with, of course, an expectation that those societies might have the impact on the stakeholders, on policymakers, that would stop NATO from being a part of the war that is happening right now in Ukraine.
And as you mentioned, this strategic ambiguity is a necessary part of the great strategic poker game about bluff, counter-bluff. How far does this go back? Does this go back before the advent of nuclear weapons? Has this always been a feature of the diplomatic conflict?
I would even say that this is actually a feature of game theory as such. I mean, you mentioned poker; it's pretty much the same.
Yes.
If you have to be ambiguous in order to win over your enemy, it is all about the cards that you hold. So the fact is that, of course, the countries, the adversaries in the modern day warfare, they expect, or they can have the expectation of what kind of troops there are on the other side. As compared to the previous times, probably there is also a bit more of the of public news, public opinion on what kind of troops the alliances possess, because we are a part of the modern day information sphere with OSINT capabilities, etc., etc. But the truth is that this lack of a proper knowledge, lack of the knowledge that you can easily check, and you have the full clarity on what the other side possess. It is, I would say, the trump card that often wins the warfare, or even actually the conflict before it escalates to warfare. And with the fact that the nuclear weapons are in possession of not only one country but a couple of countries, or even more than only a couple of countries, then in fact this ambiguity is I would say, a common denominator in the common war in the modern day warfare, and it is actually the feature that can, or was actually, the strategic element of the success in the Cold War times.
Yes, let's take the great example of the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962. One expert on poker, which I've read, analysed the Cuban Missile Crisis in terms of a poker game, and he laid out which cards the Soviet side had, which cards the American side had, and he then said, well, this is a game of bluff, counter bluff. You don't bluff too often. You've got to find out which the timing of when you bluff. Bluff is part of the game. It is the game, and he seemed to suggest that this was part of the Cuban Missile Crisis as well. This was a game of bluff for Russians, and the Russians, or the Soviets, sorry, folded first. Is it as simple as that?
I mean, to some degree, it is simple as that. But on the other side, this was also based on the knowledge that both sides had about themselves when it comes to the escalation dominance that one could have over the other. So of course you can analyze the Cuban crisis in terms of the game theory, also in terms of how diplomatically speaking successful it was for, in fact, both sides, because of course Khrushchev lost in the end with the fact that actually he was blamed by the Soviet Union, other leaders, Politburo, that it was his fault not to go one step farther. But in the end, it was actually a success of both sides, having in mind that that it didn't cost the nuclear warfare at that point. But it was also a time of the realization from the American side that they should change the doctrine over the usage of the nuclear weapons, and to treat Soviets differently than they used to prior to the Cuban crisis. Because prior to the Cuban crisis, I would say that they had like almost a thinking that they could always win any kind of the confrontation with Soviets, especially when the nuclear weapons were at stake.
Herman Kahn and his theory about winning a strategic nuclear war. Does that rely on the fact that both actors in a game of poker, if we pursue that analogy, both actors are rational people?
Well,
we think what we think of the Russians, but they are rational after all, aren't they? They have a certain limits to their behaviour.
Well, I remember there is a song by Sting when he sings that he hopes that Russians also love their own children.
Yes.
I mean, of course, this is like you would always think that the other side acts in a rational way. The question is whether what you define as a rational activity is also the definition of on the other side. Because right now, of course, among the NATO allies, the threshold of using the nuclear arms during the warfare is different, politically different than it is probably in Russia. Of course, we hope that Russians do not treat nuclear arms as just one of the tools in their palette of activities during the conventional war, but politically speaking, there is a different threshold of potentially using them among the democratic countries that are a part of the NATO alliance and among Russian elites that are autocratic. So even if you count on different elements, then not only looking at the potential of using the nuclear arms during the conflict on the basis of the purely military thinking, but you also take into account what kind of a political systems there are, what kind of the impact of the societies could have in both camps, then is completely different. So I would say that, of course, we could count. We hope potentially, as we did also during the Cold War times, that both sides treat this whole confrontation in a rational way. But in the end, there are also other factors that are not only human-driven,
Yes.
but also the system-driven, etc., etc.
Yes, maybe a rational decision to launch a war. After all, you're not necessarily peace-driven, I suppose. But is that one of the faults of our system, as in the West, that we are too open? We don't have this strategic ambiguity that you mentioned earlier on. We're too open about what we're going to do in Ukraine, what our strategy for dealing with Russia. Are we just too soft on this?
The problem is that, of course, we treated the communication lines with the other side very seriously. We communicate very often what we would do and what we wouldn't do. This is also, I would say, the lesson of the Cuban crisis, where actually the communication lines between Washington and the Kremlin were established after the crisis. But it is actually the lesson of, I would say, maybe the last 30 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, that we learned to treat Russia differently. We hoped that we could actually treat Russia differently. The question is whether the Russians were acting in pretty much the same way when it comes to NATO, whether they were always planning to re-establish their dominance over the Eastern Europe, and it was only a tool in their toolbox to act that way when they communicated with NATO, trying to to find some kind of a hope on our side.
Yeah, I mean, NATO invited representatives into NATO's headquarters, so is that a gesture of generosity or weakness? Is that?
I wouldn't say it was a gesture of generosity or of a weakness, neither of these. But we treated actually dialogue as a part of this, of the way we engage with Russians. Possibly for too long. That is the issue. But it was never the case that I wouldn't say that during the last 30 years or 20 or so years, it was always like that even in Poland, people were always convinced that Russia should be only treated as a potential enemy. There were, of course, times of the taunt, politically speaking, military speaking. The times have changed during the last 20-something years. Right now, the dialogue as a part of the how we treat Russia, how we should communicate with Russia, also in terms of the military potential that we have, has changed. Simply speaking, I mean, we are in the different world that we were a couple of years ago, even a couple of years ago. So, having said that, The dialogue is right now, I wouldn't say the main part of our dealing with Russia. It's rather the defense and the deterrence. Those two Ds, I would say. The third D is not there anymore, at least at this point. Because what I would say is it is the question about whether we have entered the second Cold War right now. Not really. I mean, we are in a hot war right now. We are discussing the potential of Russia to nuclear escalation against NATO countries. So this is a very much hot war. What we are experiencing also in Ukraine. We are listening to President Macron's speeches about the potential to deploy NATO troops. This is very much hot war. But what we could expect, potentially also from the expert side, it is that the Cold War would probably follow. What we are fighting right now, what we are politically fighting right now, it is only where the curtain will fall. Hopefully, in the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine.
So it's a question of definition. As if we define the Cold War, hot war, as you put it, that's is what determines our behaviour in terms of dialogue with Russia.
What kind of tools we use, certainly, what kind of lines of communication that we have, because right now I wouldn't say that there are lines of communication, proper lines of communications. Communication, as I said previously, after the Cuban crisis, there were lines of communications established between Washington and the Kremlin. Potentially, if we enter the second Cold War after the war in Ukraine ends, then probably we would have to establish some kind of lines of communication in order to de-escalate. Right now, we are, I would say, in a very hot war period.
Final question for you: does it make sense to have tactical nuclear weapons and strategic nuclear weapons, or are they all strategic?
If they are used, I would say that they should be treated as strategic. I mean, there is any kind of escalation that will result from the usage of even something which you would nickname the tactical nuke will be unbearable, and in that regard, it will have the strategic impact.
We've run out of time as usual in these discussions, so Bartłomiej Kot, thank you very much for coming onto our programme.
Thank you very much.
Join us again for the next time on How We Got Here.